Hello everybody, my name is Aaron Kent and today I'm going to speak to you about my PhD project and how it intersects with scholarship surrounding Teresa Deevy. Firstly, I'll introduce the project and then I'll outline some of the research questions and objectives. The PhD title is Reshaping Narratives, an analysis of life and culture as dramatised by Irish women playwrights following the Irish War of Independence between the years 1922 and 59. It's a project hosted by Waterford Institute of Technology, where my supervisors are Dr. Una Keeley and Dr. Kate McCarthy. The project was funded in 2020 by the Irish Research Council. Some of the central research questions include: how did the Irish War of Independence manifest within dramatic literature authored by Irish women playwrights between 1922 and 59, and how then did those playwrights critique, challenge and reinterpret accepted or prevalent narratives of Irish life between the same dates? Some of the key objectives include investigating the War of Independence as a socio-cultural event through the plays of Irish women, and investigate dominant concepts of the time, including nationalism, narrative, and feminism. It is hoped that the original contribution of the PhD will be strengthened by recouping and analysing women's playwrights' critique of Irish society within dramatic texts and performances during the period 1922 to 1959. As 1922 to 1959 is such a broad time span, we propose to break the analysis chapters of this project into decades. This graphic gives a brief outline of how the cultural context of Ireland changed throughout the decades of this project. Beginning in the 1920s, of course, which saw the end of the Irish War of Independence, the partition of North and South, and the establishment and the eventual devolution of the political situation into civil war. In contrast, in the 1930s saw a much more stable political situation, with Fianna Fáil rising to electoral dominance, but this stability also led to the marriage of church and state in many instances. Two of the most prominent being the 1932 Eucharistic Congress, where De Valera used the opportunity of hosting the Catholic hierarchy to portray himself as a Catholic statesman. This church-state relationship was formalised later in the decade with the establishment of the 1937 Constitution. The 40s in Ireland then, like any country, particularly European country, were marked by the outbreak of World War II, Ireland being notable in that it did not participate in the war effort of its neighbouring allies and instead chose to exercise its independence by declaring neutrality. It is also notable in terms of this project that the emerging fascist ideology in Europe also promotes restrictive gender roles. Finally then, the 1950s were years of economic stagnation in Ireland, mass unemployment, mass immigration, which eventually culminated in Eamon de Valera's resignation as Taoiseach and the effective end of the isolationist period known as De Valera's Ireland. It is at this point in 1959 that this project will also end. Okay, so despite this shift in culture and context, Monaghan 2014 makes the point that Ireland was an unusual post-imperial country in as democratic institutions were established relatively quickly and remained relatively stable. Again, this stability led to a different social realities for men and women, and in this sense, Irish independence was a gendered experience. These are just a few points on how the circumstances of men and portrayal of men and women differed before and after the War of Independence. In pre-independence Ireland, Irish women made a significant military contribution, an example of which being the organisation Cum na Bán, which had in its height 11,000 members across 838 branches. Pre-independence Ireland also saw a sophisticated and diverse women's movement, which was unlike the nationalist movement in that it was divided by the nationalist question. Women also played an equal role in James Connolly's Irish Citizen Army during the 1916 Rising, all of which was recognised by both the 1916 Proclamation and the 1922 Free State Constitution, which promised equality without distinction of sex. In post-independence Ireland then, commemoration ceremonies portrayed women. In commemoration ceremonies of post-independence Ireland, women were immediately recast as mourners and bystanders, whereas men were portrayed in the role of protagonists and martyrs. As mentioned before, the 1937 Constitution formalised the church-state relationship and also gave a legal backing to the suggestion that women should occupy a reduced public role. Interestingly, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington suggested this constitution was based on a fascist model in which women would be relegated to permanent inferiority. So in terms of narrative's role in these developments, narratives are formulated, reformulated, lifted from their occasions of production and inserted into new contexts in a continuous process that is often regulated by the more powerful parties. all of which becomes a very useful way to consider the circulation of the ideas between the institutions of the Irish Free State, the Catholic Church, and the Irish media. Narrative tellings may serve as occasion for the exercise of power and domination and for the perpetration of or creation of social inequalities. Obvious narrative tellings being moments obvious narrative tellings are moments when speaking rights are unequally spread through a group, like the like of which can be seen in this picture, where one speaker is elevated above a group that is required to listen. Mass is another such example of this, as are political rallies and many other events within the electoral campaigns. This project will then explore the function of these narratives in Irish society after the War of Independence, while also focusing on lesser represented counter-narratives within the work of Irish women playwrights. Just to consider how this restrictive cultural situation may have impacted the remembrance of Teresa Deevy, I have compared two quotes, the first being from Irish poet John Jordan, who in 1956 said, "Synge and O'Casey are dramatic giants in this century, and of course, by virtue of one play, Mr. Samuel Beckett. But there is the distinguished class of those who are only less than great. I believe Teresa Deevy should be counted among this select band, and within her chosen field, she is incomparable." Now, from a poet who suggested that Deevy is the best Irish playwright in her area, to a scholar in 1995 who was given a copy of Katie Roach, Deevy's best known work, and said, "I was surprised simply by the existence of another female Irish playwright in the first half of the century, apart from Augusta Gregory, how and why, 100 years after her birth, had Teresa Deevy returned to the theatrical nowhere from which she had emerged." These quotes, I hope, illustrate the conflict between Deevy's consideration by her contemporaries and her historic recognition. And it is this disparity which this PhD project hopes to address. To explore how Deevy's work may allow us to do this, I will outline some brief examples of how prominent social ideas emerge and are resisted in her place. Okay, so Teresa Deevy herself was born in Waterford in 1894. She received a Catholic education in the Ursuline Convent. She's a member of the Cumann na Báin, and she has an extensive body of work, including 25 plays, such as Reapers, In Search of Valor, Temporal Powers, King of Spain's Daughter, Katie Roach, and Wild Goose. So, beginning the analysis with King of Spain's Daughter, where perhaps the most jarring sentiments are those concerning gender, particularly the fixed ideas concerning the roles of men and women, which are expressed by most of the main characters. For example, it is suggested multiple times that women become disorientated around weddings and that a man wanting his dinner is a just reason for his violence. It is also suggested by Annie's father that she is his possession and will be until she marries and is then owned by her husband. It is also suggested by Miss Marks that the true reality of marriage is best hidden from young women. And what is interesting in terms of counter-narratives, which may run against the grain of Irish society, is that Annie portrays a young woman with sexual agency. To this, Miss Marks replies by saying, "'Tis well," meaning Jim's mother, "is in the grave." And by this sentiment, she means that Jim's mother is better off dead than to see him romantically interested in a woman that has perceived loose morals. Also interesting as a potential counter-narrative is Annie's reaction to Jim's saving book. To him, and in line with the Catholic social teaching of the time, it shows that he is committed to their marriage, that he is reliable, and that he is capable of being frugal. Whereas to Annie, this marriage fund, which he continued to add to while they were not on speaking terms, showcases a threatening determination and a disregard for her own preferences. There are also parallels with the gender narratives of later decades when Miss Marks discourages Jim from protecting Annie against the violence of her father by saying, "Great cheer to see her standing upright if yourself was lying low," suggesting that to assist an immoral or fallen woman is socially taboo, and this, of course, is similar to the rhetoric that later emerges in Ireland in an attempt to police unmarried mothers. Moving on then to Katie Roach. And one of the more immediate examples emerged when Stanislas said he wanted Katie for her heart and for her mind, to which Katie responded by saying, "My heart and my mind, it's a queer way to love, to take my body to pieces." And this consideration of women as concepts rather than individuals has precedent in our society of the time, the most famous example of which being the symbolic ashling, which the nationalist movement attempted to reclaim from colonial discourse. This attitude of reclaiming Irish purity is also evident in Katie's obsession with her imaginary version of her pure heritage, an approach later complicated by her own comment on the inescapability of history when she said that fresh starts were impossible, for won't we bring ourselves with us? And Reuben's role is also notable within the play, as he is the character most associated with the church and but also the one that is calling for Katie to be flogged as punishment. There's also a suggestion in the play of religion's status as a means of self-service in Irish society. Firstly, in Michael's comment that his mother would pay Reuben to pray for peace in the world, but also for her cough to be cured. This sentiment appears later in the play when Katie mounts religious pictures on the wall, then shakes her head at something that had failed her, when they do not prevent her relationship with Stanislas from deteriorating. And finally then, the last play I'll look at briefly is Wife to James Whelan, the title of which is itself suggestive, in that a character of one gender retains their name, whereas the other is named by their marital status. This discrepancy in treatment is reflected by the characters of the play, whose comments acknowledge the inevitable inequality of marriage. One example being that of Nan, who responds to Katie's suggestion to maintain her romantic relationship with James by saying, "He's too much master, you couldn't brook him," which exemplifies the broader social ideal of marriage as a contest. Whereas Nora Keane refers to James's following of instruction as an indicator of intimacy, saying, "Funny the way you fell in and did what she wanted," as a criticism when James accommodates Nan's suggestion. Finally, then, it's worth noting social ideas around the burden of familial care emerge when Nan is prevented from providing for herself by an obligation to maintain her dead husband's father. And also of note is the use of formality by James Whelan to achieve outcomes that reflect his own worldview. This can be seen when he reverts to calling Nora Miss Keane when trying to get her to pay full fare as a matter of principle, and when he insists on Nan being punished to the letter of the law despite their personal relationship and social pressure not to do so, all of which could be seen to mirror the narrative circulating in broader Irish society, which reflected Catholic social teaching and a perceived natural order of gender roles as a guise to manifest individual opinion as inevitable reform. All of which brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen.